The deed was in his hands, and Susan Prescott was standing in the cold February wind with nothing but her late husband's name on a piece of paper that Martin Calloway clearly did not consider worth the ink it was printed on. "You have until the end of the week," Martin said, his voice flat and unyielding as the iron-gray sky above the Kansas plains. He did not look at her directly. He looked past her, at the land, at the frozen furrows of the east field, at the barn that still bore his father's initials carved into the lintel post. His jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. "That deed transfers to me. My brother's debt was his own, but the land belongs to the Calloway name. It always has." Susan felt the cold bite through her wool coat, through the thin cotton of the dress beneath it, straight down into her bones. She had been cold since the telegram arrived telling her that Thomas was dead. She had been cold since the lawyer in Abilene read the will that left her a widow at 26 with 2 stepchildren, a mortgaged homestead, and a brother-in-law she had met exactly twice at family gatherings where he had spoken perhaps 12 words to her. "Thomas was your brother," she said. Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that. "He built this house. He broke this ground. He is buried under that cottonwood at the edge of the south pasture, and his children sleep in that bedroom upstairs. You want me to tell them they are losing their home because their father owed a debt to a bank you own half of?" Martin finally looked at her. The force of it hit her like a physical thing. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the winter light, and they were burning with something that she could not quite name. It was not cruelty. She had expected cruelty, had braced herself for it, and what she found instead was something far more dangerous and far more hidden. It was grief dressed up as righteousness, and it made him all the more immovable. "What I want," he said quietly, "is irrelevant. The law is the law, Mrs. Prescott, and the law says that land reverts." She took one step closer to him, and he did not back away, which she respected even as she prepared to fight him with everything she had. "The law also says a widow has rights, Mr. Calloway. I suggest you find yourself a very good lawyer, because I intend to find one better." She turned and walked back into the house before her hands could start shaking visibly. The door closed behind her, and the warmth of the kitchen fire hit her face, and she stood very still for a long moment, listening to the sound of his horse moving away through the frozen mud of the yard. That was the moment she understood she was in a battle she had not chosen and could not afford to lose. It had begun 6 months earlier, in August of 1878, when she arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, on the back of a rattling stagecoach with a trunk, a carpetbag, and a contract of marriage arranged through a correspondence bureau in St. Louis. Thomas Calloway had been a decent man. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own private accounting, because decency mattered in a world that did not always offer it. He was 34, quiet and methodical, with rough hands and a kind laugh, and he had written her letters for 5 months before she agreed to come west. The letters were careful and honest. He told her about the land, 480 acres of prime grazing land and cropland that his father had claimed under the Homestead Act in 1872. He told her about his 2 children, Clara, who was 9, and James, who was 7. He told her that their mother had died of typhoid fever 2 years prior, and that the children needed a mother's presence more than he could adequately provide alone. He did not oversell himself. He did not promise her romance or adventure or a life free of hardship. He promised her a home and a fair partnership, and she had found that more trustworthy than any grand declaration. She had come from a respectable but diminished family in Missouri. Her father had been a schoolteacher who died with more books than dollars. Her mother had followed him 6 months later, and Susan had spent 2 years keeping herself afloat through seamstress work and teaching at a small church school, until the strain and the loneliness made the advertisement for Western brides seem less like desperation and more like possibility. The marriage had been 3 months old when Thomas rode out to check the fence line after a storm, and his horse threw him, crossing a flooded creek. He was dead before anyone found him, and Susan was left in a situation that was worse than desperation, and yet strangely clarifying. She had stepchildren who needed her. She had a home she had begun to love. She had a piece of land that felt more truly hers in 3 months of working it than anything she had ever owned in her life. She was not going to leave. Martin Calloway arrived at the homestead 2 weeks after the funeral, and the first thing Susan noticed was that he rode a very good horse, and that he held himself in the saddle like someone who was accustomed to owning everything his eye fell upon. He was 32 years old and had built himself into one of the most prosperous men in Barber County. He ran cattle, owned shares in a bank in Medicine Lodge, and had his fingers in the hide trade. People spoke of him in the way they spoke of weather systems and railroad routes, as a fact of life to be navigated rather than questioned. He had been polite, that first visit, formally and coldly polite. He expressed condolences in the voice of a man who had rehearsed them. He asked after Clara and James in a way that suggested he felt obligated to ask, and then he spoke about the deed. Thomas had borrowed against the land to fund improvements the previous year, a new barn and a well, and a section of fencing. The loan had come from the Medicine Lodge Bank, and Martin held a partial interest in the outstanding debt. With Thomas dead and the estate in question, the terms of the loan gave the bank the right to call the debt due. Martin had, he explained to Susan with a precision that felt almost surgical, every legal and financial justification for claiming the land as satisfaction for the debt. Susan had spent that night reading every document in Thomas's strongbox by candlelight while Clara and James slept. By morning she had a clear enough picture to know that Martin was right about the law mostly, and that she had very little ground to stand on unless she fought creatively and kept him talking long enough to find a foothold. What she had not anticipated was how fiercely she would come to love the land itself. The homestead sat on a gentle rise above a creek that Thomas had named Larkspur Creek because of the flowers that bloomed purple and violet along its banks in April. The house was solid, built of native limestone that had been hauled from a quarry 7 miles south, and it had 4 rooms and a covered porch that faced east so you could watch the sun come up over the flat immensity of the prairie. The barn was new and smelled of fresh timber. The east field was broken and waiting for spring planting. There were 6 good horses, a milk cow named Adelaide, a flock of chickens, and 2 sheep that James had named Biscuit and Gravy with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who knew what mattered. Susan had walked every inch of the 480 acres in the weeks after Thomas's death, partly because she needed to understand what she was fighting for, and partly because the walking helped her think. The land was beautiful in the way that flat, wide country is beautiful, not decorative beauty, not the kind you frame and hang, but the kind that gets inside you and rearranges something fundamental. The sky here was bigger than any sky she had ever seen. The grass went gold in autumn and bent in waves under the wind, and when the light was right in the late afternoon, it turned the whole plain into something that looked briefly like the promised land. She was not letting Martin Calloway have it. The trouble was that fighting him required resources she did not have. She needed a lawyer, and good lawyers in the Kansas frontier charged fees she could not pay out of what was left in Thomas's cash box. She needed time, because property disputes in territorial courts moved slowly and could be dragged out by a determined opponent. And she needed allies. It was Clara who gave her the first one without meaning to. Clara Calloway, as sharp-eyed and practical as her father had been and twice as direct, informed Susan over breakfast one morning in mid-September that there was a man named Eli Garver in Caldwell who had once worked for the Medicine Lodge Bank and had left under circumstances that were, according to the gossip, Clara had absorbed like a small determined sponge, extremely unfriendly. Susan had raised her eyebrows at a 9-year-old's intelligence network, and Clara had looked back at her with the expression of someone who had been managing adults' information gaps for most of her life. Eli Garver turned out to be a former bank clerk who had been dismissed after raising questions about the way certain loans were structured and certain collateral agreements were written. He was a thin, precise man of about 40 who now kept a small notary and document office on the edge of town, and who had a very long memory and a somewhat comprehensive collection of copied documents that he had removed from the bank when he left, not entirely legally, but with a thoroughness that proved useful. What he showed Susan over the course of 3 visits changed everything. The loan agreement on the Calloway homestead had a clause that was, Garver explained with the controlled excitement of a man who had been waiting years for someone to find a use for this information, legally problematic. The clause, buried in the 4th page under a paragraph about interest accrual, stated that in the event of the borrower's death, the outstanding loan could only be called due after a period of 1 full year from the date of death, during which time any surviving spouse had the right to maintain the property and to seek refinancing. The clause had been written into the standard loan documents at the insistence of a territorial judge who had served on the bank's early advisory committee, and it had never been formally removed, which meant that Martin Calloway's timeline for seizing the property was not legal. He could not demand the land until August of 1879. This did not resolve the problem. It delayed it. Thomas had borrowed $800, which in 1878 was a sum that required either the sale of livestock or a harvest season and possibly both. Susan had 7 or 8 months to find $800 or to find a legal argument that would forestall the debt entirely. But it was something. It was a foothold. When she appeared at Martin's ranch in late September with the document clause marked, and a copy of the territorial statutes tucked under her arm, the expression on his face was the most satisfying thing she had seen since she stepped off the stagecoach. He read the clause twice. He said nothing for a long moment, and Susan stood in his front parlor and looked at the room around her and understood a great deal about Martin Calloway in a single sustained observation. The room was scrupulously neat and almost completely impersonal. There were no photographs, no needlework, no evidence of comfort or softness of any kind. There was a very good rifle above the fireplace and a desk covered in ledgers and correspondence. The room looked like the office of a man who was winning at something and who did not quite know what to do with the winning when he got home. "You have until next August, then," Martin said finally. "I have until next August," Susan agreed, "and I intend to use every day of it." He looked at her for a moment with that burning, unreadable expression, and then something crossed his face that might have been, in another kind of man, a reluctant smile. "Thomas said you were practical," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned his brother in any way that sounded like a living memory rather than a legal category. "Thomas was right about several things," Susan said. "He was wrong about a few others. I'm working on those." She left before he could respond, which she was beginning to understand was the most effective strategy she had with Martin Calloway. He was a man who was very good at controlling a conversation once it had settled into predictable territory, and the only way to keep him off balance was to refuse to give him anything he could predict. The autumn passed in hard work and careful planning. Susan threw herself into the homestead with a focus that left her exhausted at the end of every day and gave her very little time to feel afraid. She was an excellent cook and a fast learner, and she had grown up watching her father manage a household with very little money, which meant she knew 17 ways to stretch a dollar. She sold eggs and butter at the Caldwell market. She took in sewing from 3 families in town. She wrote to a seed supplier in Kansas City about the East Field and negotiated a credit arrangement that allowed her to put in a full winter wheat planting before the ground froze. Clara and James watched her with the quiet, assessing attention of children who had already lost one parent and were not prepared to lose their certainty again. Susan understood what they needed without being told. She was steady with them. She was honest. When Clara asked her directly one evening in October whether they were going to have to leave, Susan sat down at the kitchen table and said no, and she meant it absolutely. The children began to trust her, in the way that children trust the adults who do not flinch. Martin came by the homestead 4 times between September and December, and each visit followed a pattern that Susan began to map with the careful attention she gave to everything that might matter. He came on the first Monday of the month, which was when most of his business rounds took him south through Caldwell. He never came inside unless she invited him. He always checked the livestock and the fence line before he came to the door, which told her something about his instincts even when his manner told her little about his heart. He asked about the children with slightly more ease each time, and Clara, who was constitutionally incapable of being cold to anyone who showed genuine interest in her, gradually began to give him information he clearly found both useful and somewhat disarming. It was on his 3rd visit, in November, that Susan first saw the hidden motive behind his relentless pursuit of the land. She had made coffee, and he had accepted a cup without the performance of reluctance he usually brought to anything that felt like accepting hospitality, and they were sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen table going over her winter wheat planting projections when he said, without any apparent change in his demeanor, "My father built this house." Susan looked up. "I know he did. He broke every acre of this east field himself, lived in a dugout for the first winter with my mother and Thomas and me. I was 4 years old." She waited. "Thomas was 6, Martin continued. He was looking at the projection papers, but she understood that he was not seeing them. He always said he remembered that first winter clearly. I think I mostly remember what Thomas told me about it afterward. There was something raw in that sentence. Something about a brother who had been the keeper of the family's oldest memories, and the brother was gone now, and the keeper was gone with him. "You're afraid the land will be the last thing left," Susan said, not as an accusation but as a plain statement of something she had been piecing together for 2 months. His eyes came up to meet hers, and for a moment she saw him without the armor, which was just a man in his early 30s with a grief he had not given himself permission to have. Then the armor went back up and he looked back at the papers. "The land is a practical matter," he said. "I know," she said, and she did not push, because she could see that the practical matter and the grief were the same thing for him, braided together so tightly that he could not separate them without risking something he was not ready to risk. She thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. She thought about it when she stood at the east field fence at sunset watching the light fade over the winter wheat she had planted, and she thought about it when she walked to the cottonwood at the edge of the south pasture and stood for a moment in front of Thomas's grave, which she visited not out of performed grief, but out of a real and complicated gratitude for the home he had given her and the children she had inherited. She had not loved Thomas romantically. She was honest enough to admit that to herself. She had liked him and respected him, and had been beginning to build something companionable between them when he died. But the land she had come to love fully and without complication, and she understood now that she and Martin Calloway were 2 people who loved the same piece of ground for reasons that were fundamentally incompatible, or at least appeared to be. December arrived with the kind of cold that the Kansas plains specialized in, a wide, flat, implacable cold that did not howl or rage but simply settled over everything like a weight. Susan had prepared carefully. The storm cellar was stocked. The livestock were sheltered. She had laid in fuel and food and had established a rhythm with the Hendersons, a neighboring family a mile to the north, where they checked on each other every 2 days through the worst of the winter weather. It was during a December storm that Martin first saved her life, which was not a phrase she would have used at the time but which was the accurate description of what happened. She had gone out to the barn after supper to check on Adelaide, the milk cow, who had been off her feed. The storm came down faster than the sky had suggested it would, and the distance from the barn to the house, which was perhaps 80 feet, became invisible in the whiteout. She knew the rope line she had strung between the two structures in anticipation of exactly this kind of emergency. But she had gone out before she strung it, which was a mistake she recognized immediately and cursed herself for efficiently as she stood in the barn doorway listening to the wind and understanding that she was genuinely lost between two fixed points 80 feet apart. She was starting to think through options when the barn door opened behind her and Martin Calloway came in with snow on his coat and the expression of a man who was going to say, "I told you so," if she gave him even the smallest opening. "The Henderson boy saw your light in the barn and came to find me," he said. "The storm came down hard." "I can see that," Susan said. "I have a rope." He tied one end to the barn post and walked her back to the house with her hand on the rope between them. And when they got inside and Clara and James came running from upstairs with the barely controlled terror of children who had been listening to the storm for 20 minutes wondering where she was, Susan felt something give way in her chest that she was not entirely sure she could account for. Martin stood in the kitchen doorway with snow melting off his coat, watching Clara grab Susan's hand and James press himself against her side, and his face held an expression that she did not quite catch before he looked away. She made him stay the night. The storm made it a practical necessity rather than a social arrangement, and they both understood that, and she made up a pallet near the kitchen fire and he accepted it without ceremony. And in the morning when the storm had cleared enough to navigate, he drank coffee with Clara and James at the kitchen table and answered James's questions about cattle with a patience that she found completely at odds with everything she thought she knew about him. James asked him if he thought Biscuit and Gravy were good names for sheep. Martin considered this very seriously. "Biscuit is excellent," he said. "Gravy is debatable, but they go together, so I would keep both." James was satisfied. Clara was watching Martin with an expression that Susan recognized as Clara's version of deciding whether someone was trustworthy, which involved about 3 times more data collection than most adults would think to apply. When Martin left, riding south through the frozen morning, Susan stood on the porch and watched him go and found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to revise her map of who he was. She had built a very useful model of Martin Calloway as an obstacle, as an antagonist, as a man driven by cold financial logic, and a possessiveness about property that bordered on obsession. The man who had spent 30 minutes answering a 7-year-old's questions about cattle did not fit cleanly into that model, and Susan Prescott did not like imprecise models. She began to watch him differently after that. January was when the real story of Martin Calloway started to become visible to her, the way a winter landscape reveals the bones of the land once the vegetation is stripped away. She learned it piece by piece from various sources. From Eli Garver, who was forthcoming about what he knew of the Calloway family history. From the Henderson family, who had been neighbors since the beginning. From Clara, who absorbed and retained everything and was beginning to trust Susan enough to share it. Martin Calloway had built his prosperity almost entirely alone. Their father, Robert Calloway, had died in 1872 when Martin was 26 and Thomas was 24. Robert had filed the original homestead claim, broken the first fields, built the limestone house with the help of a borrowed crew from a neighboring settlement. He had also carried a debt that was larger and more complicated than he had let either of his sons understand, and when he died of a heart seizure in the spring, Martin discovered that the land was encumbered in 3 different directions, and that without serious and immediate work, it would all be lost before summer. Thomas had been the gentler of the 2 brothers, more suited to the patient, methodical work of farming. Martin had the harder edges and the business instinct, and it was Martin who spent the next 4 years working multiple jobs, running cattle for other ranchers, negotiating, saving, and making the kinds of decisions that required a person to become somewhat ruthless about their feelings in order to execute. He had paid off every debt. He had built a separate operation of his own on land he claimed adjacent to the homestead, and gradually turned the Medicine Lodge Bank investment and the cattle operation into something that gave him genuine security. He had done all of this because he was terrified that the land would leave the family, not out of greed, not out of cold calculation. Out of the most primal fear a person raised on the frontier could have, that the thing their family had sacrificed for, the ground that held their history and their dead and their becoming, would be swallowed by debt and loss and the indifferent mechanics of commerce. Susan sat with this understanding one evening in mid-January, watching the fire burn down in the kitchen hearth, and felt the whole geometry of her situation shift. She was not fighting a greedy man. She was fighting a grieving one. And grieving men, in her experience, were considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous than greedy ones, because they were fighting for something they could not get back, which meant they never quite knew when to stop. It also meant that the ground between them was not irreconcilable. It only looked that way from a distance. She began to approach things differently. When Martin came for his January visit, she did not meet him at the door with documents and legal citations. She had James and Clara out in the yard, and she was helping them build something that was theoretically a fence for their imaginary livestock empire, but was practically an excuse to be outside in the thin winter sunshine, and she waved Martin over without ceremony and handed him the post she was holding and said, "Hold this while I pack the dirt around it." He held the post. James directed the packing operations with the authority of someone who had given this a great deal of thought. Martin held the post and looked vaguely bewildered and did not leave for 2 hours. She showed him the winter wheat that afternoon, walking the east field with him in the cold blue light of a January afternoon, explaining the planting decisions she had made and the yield projections she had calculated with Garver's help, and the plans she had for the spring planting that would, if the weather cooperated, produce enough surplus to make a significant payment toward the outstanding loan. Martin listened with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the field, and she could see him processing what she was saying with the part of his mind that understood farming and finance and land, and she could also see him processing it with the part of his mind that was looking at his father's east field with someone who cared for it properly, which was something he had not been prepared for. "You know what you're doing," he said finally. It was not a compliment exactly. It was the slightly reluctant recognition of competence from a man who had not expected to find it. "Thomas taught me some of it," she said, "and I learned fast." "Thomas wasn't much for teaching," Martin said. "He always said he learned best by watching." "He did," Susan said. "He watched everything." It was the first real conversation they had had about Thomas, and it cracked something open between them. Not widely, not enough to let in a great deal of light immediately, but a crack nonetheless. They walked back toward the house in a silence that was different in quality from the silences they had shared before, less armored, less tactical. At the porch steps Martin paused and looked at the house, at the limestone walls and the east-facing windows and the covered porch, and she watched him see something that she had come to understand in her months of living here. The house was more than a structure. It was evidence. It was the physical record of a family's determination to belong to a place and have the place belong to them. "I'm not going to lose this land, Martin," she said quietly, not as a challenge, as a statement of something that was simply true. He looked at her. The winter light made his features sharp and the darkness in his eyes very clear. "Neither am I," he said, but his voice had a different quality than it had carried in August or September. The certainty was still there, but the coldness had thinned. He rode away, and Susan went inside, and Clara said from the kitchen table where she was doing her arithmetic, "He stayed longer this time," with the air of someone keeping very precise records. "He did," Susan agreed. "Good," said Clara, and went back to her arithmetic. The February confrontation with the deed had happened 2 weeks after the January visit, and it was the moment that Susan replayed most often when she tried to understand what came next. Martin had come with a copy of the deed and a letter from the bank's attorney outlining the transfer process, and she had stood in the yard and told him she would find a better lawyer, and she had gone inside before he could see her hands shaking. But the confrontation was not what mattered most about that day. What mattered was what happened afterward. She was at the kitchen table that evening, writing figures on paper, and trying to map a path through the financial terrain that did not end in losing the homestead, when James appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightgown and said, in the tone of someone reporting an important observation, "Uncle Martin looked sad today." Susan put down her pen. "Did he? He always looks like that when he looks at the house," James said. "Like when something hurts but you don't want to say it hurts." Susan looked at her 7-year-old stepson in the lamplight and understood several things simultaneously. She understood that children see through armor with a completeness that adults lose somewhere along the way. She understood that James loved his uncle, even this difficult and armored version of him, with the unconditional accuracy of a child who had lost his father and was not going to let go of what was left. And she understood that the path she needed to find was not through the courts or through Eli Garver's hidden documents or through a better lawyer. Those were all rearguard actions, ways of buying time. The real path was through the grief, not manipulation. She was clear with herself about that. She was not going to pretend to feelings she did not have in order to soften Martin Calloway's legal position. She was not built for deception, and she respected him too much to try it. But there was something between them that was real, a genuine recognition, a complicated alignment of values that both of them were dancing around because neither of them had been given the circumstances in which to acknowledge it directly. She decided to acknowledge it directly. She wrote Martin a letter. She sat at the kitchen table the next morning after the children left for the school 2 miles north, and she wrote 4 pages in her careful, schoolteacher's hand. She wrote about the east field and what it looked like in the January light. She wrote about the winter wheat and the spring projections. She wrote about Clara and James and the way James had named his sheep, and the way Clara read to herself at night by candlelight when she thought everyone else was asleep. She wrote about the limestone house and what it felt like to live in something that someone had built with the specific intention of permanence. And she wrote about what she understood about his father and his brother, and the fear of losing the thing your family had broken themselves to build. She did not write about feelings. She wrote about facts. But the facts she chose to write about were the ones that she knew would find the crack in his armor, because they were the truth of what she saw when she looked at the homestead and at him, and at the whole tangled situation they were both standing in the middle of. She sealed it and sent it with the Henderson boy who made the mail run every week. Martin did not come for 2 weeks after the letter. She noticed his absence and refused to let herself interpret it one way or another. When he came, it was not on the first Monday. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, and he came with a wagon instead of on horseback, and the wagon had in it 3 posts and 20 yards of new wire fencing. He said without preamble that the southeast corner of the south pasture fence was down and he had happened to have the materials. She came out of the house and looked at the wagon and then at him, and something about the studied casualness of his expression made it very difficult to keep her face composed. "Did you read the letter?" she asked. "I read the letter," he said, and he looked away at the south pasture fence line. "The southeast corner is down," he said. She went with him. They fixed the fence together in the cold afternoon, working in the comfortable and slightly charged silence of 2 people who have things to say and are choosing the order carefully. Martin worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing physical labor since before he was old enough to understand what it was, and she worked beside him and learned the pattern of it and matched it, and after a while the work itself became a kind of conversation. When they were done, he straightened up and looked at the repaired line and said, without looking at her, "My father used to say that the land doesn't care who owns it. The land just is. The people are the ones who care." Susan brushed dirt from her gloves. "Your father sounds like he understood things clearly." "He understood most things," Martin said. "He just didn't understand that understanding something and surviving something aren't the same." The February light was turning orange over the western horizon, and the repaired fence stretched clean and straight across the south pasture corner, and Susan Prescott looked at Martin Calloway and saw, very clearly, that he was in the process of becoming someone she could love, not as a project or a strategy, not as a way of winning an argument, but as the natural consequence of watching a man in a difficult situation show his actual character over and over until it became unmistakable. He was stubborn and armored and driven by fears he had never fully faced. He was also principled and skilled and capable of patience and capable of a tenderness he kept very carefully hidden, and that James, with 7-year-old precision, had identified perfectly. She was in significant trouble. March arrived, and with it the first real thaw, and the world opened up in the way it only does after a hard Kansas winter, with a completeness and a color that felt almost violent after the months of gray and white. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the early wildflowers pushed up through the mud along its banks, and the east field showed the green of the winter wheat coming up strong and clean. Susan worked the land with everything she had. She was up before dawn and she fell into bed after dark, and she did not stop working, because she was farming a 480-acre homestead with 2 children and minimal hired help, and the land demanded everything, and she gave it willingly. She had hired a man named Otis, a former Union Army veteran of perhaps 50 who had drifted through Caldwell looking for seasonal work, and he was steady and reliable and taught her 3 things about horses that she had not known and did not forget. Martin came more frequently in March. There was not always an explicit reason which they both understood and neither of them acknowledged. He fixed things. He consulted on the spring planting. He brought Clara a book from the Caldwell dry goods store that had a selection of reading material, a volume of natural history illustrated with engravings, and the look on Clara's face when she received it was something that lodged itself in Susan's chest like a splinter she could not quite reach. One afternoon in mid-March, they were sitting on the porch after a long afternoon of fence work and planting preparation, tired and dirty and sharing the comfortable exhaustion of people who have worked hard toward the same end, and Martin said, without turning to look at her, "I was wrong about the timeline." She turned to look at him. The lone clause, not just the lone clause. He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned enough about his silences to know this one was one of the ones where he was deciding what to let out. "I thought the fastest way to protect the land was to consolidate control of it. I thought if it was under one name, one operation, one clear line of ownership, it was safe. And now," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the March evening light was doing something extraordinary to his face, softening the lines of it, bringing forward something she had suspected was in there but had rarely seen this clearly. "Now I think the land is already protected," he said, "better than I was managing." It was not, by the standards of any romantic tradition she knew, a declaration, but she had been around Martin Calloway long enough to understand that what he had just said by him in that voice, meant several very large things that he was not quite ready to say directly. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the east field where the winter wheat was growing in the late light. "James asked me this morning if you were going to take the land," she said. Martin's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know yet," she said honestly. He was quiet. "Then tell him no." She looked at him. "Is that your decision?" "Tell him no," Martin repeated. His voice was low and very certain, and had in it none of the legal framework formality he usually used when discussing the homestead. It had in it only the voice of a man making a commitment that he intended to keep. Susan Prescott looked at Martin Calloway in the March evening light and felt the entirety of the past 7 months reorganize themselves around this moment. The long autumn of documents and projections and careful negotiation. The January afternoon in the east field. The February standoff in the yard, the fence work and the letter and the book for Clara and James and his 7-year-old certainty about his uncle's sadness. All of it had been leading here, to a porch at sunset in early spring, with the winter wheat coming up strong in the east field, and a man who was discovering that the best way to protect his family's land was to recognize that the family had grown. "Stay for supper," she said. He stayed. Supper was the kind of loud, specific, chaotic event that meals with young children always were. Clara expounding on the natural history book, with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that the world was considerably more interesting than she had previously been informed, and James reporting at length on the behavior of Biscuit and Gravy that afternoon, and Otis stopping by the kitchen to return a tool and being pressed into staying by Clara's ruthless hospitality. Martin sat at the table in the middle of all of it and ate and listened, and occasionally answered James's questions about cattle with the same patient seriousness he always brought to them. And Susan watched him from across the table, and understood that whatever dark past had built him into someone who could only express love through control and acquisition, and the language of legal claims, he was capable of coming out the other side of it. She also understood that she wanted very much to be there when he did. After supper, after Clara and James were in bed and Otis had gone to the bunkroom, and the kitchen was quiet with just the fire and the lamplight, Martin stood with his hat in his hands near the door, the position of a man who knows he should leave and is not quite ready to, and Susan stood at the kitchen counter not quite pretending to be busy. "The debt," she said. "It had to be acknowledged. They could not pretend it was resolved when it was not. I have a yield projection that says the spring harvest, if the weather holds, gives me enough to pay 600 of the 800. There's a wool buyer coming through Caldwell in June who has offered a price on this year's shearing that covers most of the rest. I need about $60 more, and I have until August." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive it," she said. "I'm telling you I intend to pay it." He turned his hat in his hands. "I know," he said again. "And then, what if I bought in?" She looked at him. "As a partner," he said. "Not an owner, a partner. The debt gets absorbed into a partnership agreement. The land stays in the Calloway name because you're a Calloway by marriage, which means the deed is already in the family. And I have an interest in the operation that is legitimate and compensated and doesn't require any of the legal maneuvering we've been doing since August." Susan stood very still. "That's a very rational solution," she said carefully. "It's a practical arrangement," Martin said, in the voice of a man who was absolutely not talking about a practical arrangement. "Martin," she said, "I'm not interested in a practical arrangement." He looked at her, and the armor was gone completely now. What was underneath it was a man who was afraid of exactly what she had been afraid of herself since March had come in with its cruel, beautiful light, afraid of wanting something and having it matter and losing it, afraid of the risk inherent in feeling anything that could not be managed with documents and deed clauses and fence posts. "No," he said. "Neither am I." The silence between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. And then he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and she met him halfway, which felt exactly right, and he kissed her with the careful, searching intensity of someone who has been holding something back for a very long time and is no longer sure what the point of holding it was. When they separated, both somewhat breathless, she looked at him and started laughing, which was not the reaction she had anticipated from herself, but which was the honest one, because 7 months of fighting a man you were apparently falling in love with was objectively a little ridiculous. And he laughed too, which she had never heard him do before, and it was a good sound, open and real, nothing like the controlled and formal version of himself he had been presenting since August. "Clara is going to be insufferable about this," Susan said. "Clara already knows," Martin said. "She told me last Tuesday that you were the best thing that had happened to the homestead since the new barn." Susan stared at him. "She said that to you. She also said she had been waiting for me to figure it out and that I was taking considerably longer than expected." Susan closed her eyes. "She is 9 years old. She is alarmingly perceptive," Martin said, with a respect that was completely genuine. They talked that evening until the fire burned very low, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, talking about everything they had been circling for months. about the land and what it meant to both of them, about Thomas, who had been the bridge between them without knowing it, about the dark past that Martin had been carrying, the years of grinding work and fear, and the forced choice between feeling things and surviving things that had turned him into someone who managed love through legal instruments, about the hidden motive behind Susan's ferocity in fighting for the homestead, which was not just survival and not just obligation to the children, but the first place she had ever felt she truly belonged, the first ground in her life that felt like hers in the deepest sense. "My father would have liked you," Martin said near midnight. "He respected people who worked without complaining about the work." "I complain internally," Susan said. "He did too," Martin said. He said it was more efficient. The spring advanced, and things moved between them with the same speed and certainty that the season brought to everything. Martin began to come every day, not always for long, but always with purpose, always with the visible ease of a man who had found his way into a place he had not known he was looking for. He and Otis developed a working relationship built almost entirely on mutual respect and economy of speech. He and Clara developed a relationship that defied easy categorization, but that seemed to involve regular and wide-ranging conversations about natural history and livestock management, and the relative merits of different types of rope, which Clara approached as an intellectual equal and Martin accepted with the equanimity of someone who had recognized early that arguing with Clara was something you did for the practice rather than the outcome. With James, it was simpler and more complete. James simply loved him, without complication or reservation, with the guileless directness of a child who had decided. Martin received this love with a carefulness that told Susan everything she needed to know about the kind of father he would be, the kind of man who understood the weight of a child's trust and treated it accordingly. In April, Martin asked her to marry him. He did it on the porch at sunset again, which she thought afterward was either coincidence or a man who had identified a working context and was smart enough to use it. He did not have a ring because he had not thought to get to a jeweler in time, which he mentioned in a tone of self-directed frustration that she found completely endearing. He said that he intended to be a better man than the one she had met in August, which was a promise she believed because she had watched him already in the process of becoming it. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which surprised her and didn't, because she had been honest with herself about her feelings for several weeks, and the only question had been the timing. Clara, who had been inside pretending not to listen and had clearly been listening to every word, appeared in the doorway approximately 3 seconds after Susan said yes and said, "Finally," in the tone of someone whose patience had been tested beyond reasonable limits. James appeared behind her. "Does this mean Uncle Martin lives here now?" "It means we'll all live somewhere together," Susan said. "Here," said James with complete confidence. "We live here. Biscuit and gravy are here." "Biscuit and gravy are a powerful argument," Martin agreed. They were married in May in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a wooden building with not enough windows but sufficient faith. Eli Garver came and brought a document as a wedding gift that proved to be the formal resolution of the loan against the homestead, arranged through the bank with the kind of creative restructuring that Garver did best, combining Susan's harvest revenue and Martin's partnership contribution, and a revised payment schedule that spread the remaining balance over 18 months at a rate the operation could sustain without strain. The deed was re-registered under the name of Martin and Susan Calloway, which Garver noted with visible satisfaction was the most legally bulletproof outcome he had engineered in his career. Susan wore a blue dress that Clara had helped her select with the deliberate authority of a 9-year-old who had strong opinions about color. Martin wore his best coat and a new hat that James had insisted on, and that sat on his head at a slightly more optimistic angle than his usual one. The Henderson family came. Otis stood in the back and tried to look like he was not moved and failed entirely. Thomas's grave, under the cottonwood at the edge of the south pasture, was visible from the church steps, And Susan stood there for a moment after the ceremony with Martin beside her, and felt the complicated wholeness of it, the gratitude and the grief, and the forward pull of something that was beginning. They walked home along the creek road because the day was warm enough for it, and because the larkspur was blooming along the water, exactly as Thomas's name for it promised, blue and purple and violent with spring color. And Clara picked armfuls of it, and James walked ahead with the absolute purposefulness of a child going home, and Martin walked beside Susan with his hand finding hers in the way that had become natural in the past 6 weeks, and she thought that this exact combination of elements was what she had come west looking for, without knowing it was what she was looking for. Summer was the fullest season she had ever lived. The winter wheat came in strong, a yield that exceeded her projections by enough to bring real relief, and the spring planting was in and growing, and the south pasture was fat with grass, and the livestock were healthy, and the operation had the feel of something that had found its balance. Martin's cattle operation provided a secondary income that took the edge off every financial calculation, and the partnership agreement that Garver had drawn up was working exactly as designed. Martin was different in the full context of daily life than he had been in the careful visits of the previous year. He was quieter in the mornings until he had his coffee, which she had expected. He was methodical to the point of ritual about the order in which he did his morning rounds, which she had not expected, but found she could map and work with. He was genuinely funny in a dry, underplayed way that she suspected most people never got close enough to discover, and that she found endlessly delightful. He was, when given permission to simply be, which was something he was still learning to give himself, warm and attentive and capable of the full weight of his considerable attention in a way that made her feel comprehensively seen. He learned to let himself be loved, which is the hardest thing some people do. Clara turned 10 in June and requested a party that involved natural history. Martin spent an afternoon constructing what he described as an educational display of local geological samples, and what Clara described as the best birthday present she had ever received, which Susan suspected was not entirely accurate, but which was accurate enough. James organized the refreshments with a thoroughness that strongly suggested he had been in consultation with someone who knew about parties, and Otis built a small wooden display stand for the geological samples that was beautifully made, and that Otis described as just something he threw together, which was also not accurate. In July, Susan told Martin she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before the children were up over the first coffee of the day, and she watched the information move across his face with the same fascination she had been applying to reading him since the previous autumn. She saw surprise, and then a stillness, and then something cracked open in him, the way spring opens a landscape, wide and sudden and completely. He put down his coffee cup and he came around the table and he held her with a completeness that said everything about what the past year had rearranged in him, and she felt him take a breath that was long and deep, and that released something he had been carrying for a very long time. "Good," he said into her hair. She laughed. "That's your response." "I have more," he said, "but I need a minute." She gave him the minute. He spent it, she understood, reorganizing around a future that included this. A child, theirs together, something built on the foundation of everything that had happened since she stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with a trunk and a carpet bag, and a stubborn refusal to be displaced. That evening, he sat on the porch with James on one side and Clara on the other. Clara reading her natural history book and James explaining at length his theory about the best configuration of an imaginary cattle operation he had been developing for weeks. And Susan sat in the doorway watching them, and understood that the family this land had been built to hold was not exactly what anyone had originally imagined. Not what Robert Calloway had imagined when he filed his homestead claim in 1872. Not what Thomas had imagined when he placed his Correspondence Bureau advertisement. not what Martin had imagined in his fierce and frightened determination to hold the land under one name. It was better. It was stranger and more complicated and more fully alive than any of those original imaginings, and it contained multitudes. A woman from Missouri who had learned to love a piece of Kansas ground like her own heartbeat. A man who had had to be argued into his own happiness by a 9-year-old and a letter written by lamplight in February. 2 children who had lost their father and found something whole in its place, and a new life growing that would be born in spring, on the land that had witnessed all of it. The August deadline came and went without drama. The loan was formally resolved. The deed was clear. Eli Garver sent a note that said simply, "All settled." "Well done, Mrs. Calloway," which made her smile every time she looked at it. Martin stood at the east field fence on the morning after the deadline passed, and Susan came out to stand beside him with 2 cups of coffee, and they looked at the land together in the early light. And it was so familiar by now, the specific quality of the light on the summer grass, the sound of the creek running behind the willows to the south, the way the land breathed in the cool of the morning. It was so deeply known to both of them that there were no words equal to it, and neither of them tried to find any. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and the land lay before them, patient and permanent in theirs, exactly as it had been before any of them arrived on it, and exactly as it would be when they were gone, but held for now by people who understood what it meant to belong to a place and have it belong back. Autumn came with its gold and its harvest, and Susan moved through the weeks with the expanding life of her pregnancy as a kind of counterweight to the physical work of the season, and Martin watched over her with a care that was not intrusive but was complete, the care of a man who had spent a long time protecting things he loved through control and was learning the difference between protection and presence. He was learning it well. Clara had developed a theory, expressed at length one October evening, that the baby would be a boy based on evidence that she declined to share on the grounds that adults would dismiss it as superstition, and that his name should have a geological reference incorporated somewhere. Martin listened to this proposal with full seriousness and said that he would take it under advisement. Clara said advisement was insufficient. She required a commitment. James said the baby should be named after a good sheep. Susan said she was grateful for everyone's input and that she and Martin would be making the final decision. "Obviously," said Clara, "I just wanted on record that I had opinions." "It is on record," Martin said solemnly, "in perpetuity." The winter of 1879 came in gentler than the previous year, which Susan took as the prairie's form of congratulation. The homestead was warm and well-stocked and alive with the organized bustle of a functioning family operation. Otis had stayed on permanently, and his steady presence was a comfort and a practical anchor. The Henderson family came for Christmas, and there was a meal that used the good dishes and the good linen, and went on for 3 hours because no one was in a hurry. Martin gave Susan a gold ring with a small garnet set in it, which he had procured in Medicine Lodge, and which he had been carrying in his coat pocket for 6 weeks, having originally intended to give it to her in October, but never quite finding a moment that felt right, which he told her in the tone of mild exasperation at himself that she had come to love particularly. She gave him a photograph taken in Caldwell in September, the 2 of them and Clara and James on the porch of the homestead, all 4 of them slightly stiff in the way people were in photographs in 1879, slightly uncertain about what their faces should be doing, but unmistakably themselves, and unmistakably a family. He looked at it for a long time. "I'm going to put this in the parlor," he said. "Wherever you like," she said. "The parlor," he said firmly, "where people can see it." She understood what that meant for a man who had spent years in rooms with no photographs. Their son was born in February of 1880, which felt exactly right to Susan, because February was when she had stood in the yard and told Martin she was not leaving, and February was when she had first understood what kind of grief was driving him, and February was in every way the month that the story between them had become irreversible. He was born in the limestone house on a clear, cold morning, with a midwife from Caldwell and Martin holding Susan's hand, with the complete and somewhat white-knuckled dedication of a man who was going to be useful through this, if it required every ounce of his considerable will. Clara had been sent to the Hendersons with James, and when they came back in the afternoon, there was a brother in the house, and Clara said, with the precision of a scientist confirming a hypothesis, "I knew it," and James said, "Can I hold him?" And he held the baby with the careful seriousness of someone who understood this was important, and the baby held James's finger with the blind tenacity of the newly arrived. They named him Robert Thomas Calloway, which honored both grandfathers and both of the men who had made the land what it was, and which felt like the right name for someone who was going to grow up on this ground with all of its history underneath him. Martin held his son that first evening with the lamp burning low and Clara and James asleep and Susan watching from the bed, and his face was doing something that she had never seen it do before and did not have a name for, something beyond the language of grief and management and the forced choice between feeling and surviving. He was simply present in it, entirely, without armor. He looked up and found her watching. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "But you did some of the work." "Not the part that counted," he said. She reached out her hand and he came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed with the baby between them, and outside, the February night was clear and cold, and the stars were the impossible density of stars on a Kansas winter night, and the land lay quiet and patient and held under the dark sky. Spring came, as spring always comes, with its relentless green insistence that things grow. Susan was on the porch with Robert in her arms, watching the east field turn from brown to the first haze of new growth, and Clara was in the yard with a notebook recording something she considered scientifically significant, and James was at the fence of the south pasture conducting a conversation with Biscuit and Gravy that she could hear fragmentarily across the yard. And Martin came around the corner of the barn with his coat dark from work, and his face carrying the particular quality of contentment that she had watched grow in him over the months until it had become his natural expression. He came up the porch steps and she handed him the baby, and he took him the way he now always did, with immediate and unthinking ease, and they stood together looking out at the land. The east field was greening. The creek was running with snowmelt. The larkspur would be up along the banks in a few weeks, blue and purple and violently beautiful, and the winter wheat was stirring under the warming ground, and the 480 acres of the Calloway homestead were exactly what they had always been, patient and permanent, and asking only that the people who held them understand the terms of the agreement. You gave everything you had. The land gave everything back. Are you happy? Martin asked her. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated because he always appreciated that she did not answer things carelessly. She looked at the field and the creek and the children and the man beside her holding their son. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked at what he had. This woman who had refused every pressure to leave, who had fought for the land with the same fierce love he had carried for it since childhood, who had found the crack in his armor not by attacking it, but by standing steady until it opened on its own, who had made herself a family out of loss and stubbornness, and an absolute clarity about what mattered. He thought about the deed in the strongbox in the parlor, which now read two names, which was more than it had ever held before, and which was, he understood finally, how it had always been meant to be, not held by one person in isolation, but by people plural who were bound to each other as firmly as they were bound to the ground. "Yes," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but truth. The spring of 1880 settled over the Kansas plains with the generosity that good years bring, and the Calloway homestead held its people and its history, and its dead under the cottonwood and its living above the rich dark earth, and the land did not leave the family, because the family had grown large enough to hold it properly, and the family was whole. 2 years on On a bright April morning when Robert was learning to walk between the kitchen table legs, with an earnestness that made everyone in the house stop what they were doing to watch, Clara, now 11, and deeply invested in the orderly continuation of the family she had assembled through observation and patient persistence, announced at breakfast that she had some thoughts about the possibility of a second baby. Martin put down his coffee cup. Susan raised an eyebrow. James looked up from his biscuit with the expression of someone prepared to have opinions about names. Clara folded her hands on the table. "I think the timing would work well," she said. "And I have been doing some research on birth order and its effects on family dynamics." "You have been doing research," Martin repeated. "Extensively," said Clara. Susan looked at Martin across the table. Martin looked at Susan. Between them was the specific communication of two people who shared everything and knew each other thoroughly and found in each other, every single day, something that was worth finding. Susan turned to Clara. "We will take your research under advisement," she said. "Advisement is insufficient," said Clara. "I require a commitment," Martin and Susan said together. Clara looked between them with the expression of someone who had achieved exactly the outcome she was aiming for. "Exactly," she said. Robert fell over between the table legs and did not cry about it, only looked surprised and then determined, and got himself upright again, which was, Susan thought, about the most accurate summary of the Calloway family she could imagine. Falling over and getting upright again, and finding that the people around you made the getting upright possible. She looked out the kitchen window at the east field where the spring planting was just going in, at the land that was theirs in every legal and binding and living sense, at the sky that was the enormous limitless sky of the Kansas plains on an April morning, blue all the way to the edge of everything. She was home. She had always been coming here. She just had not known it until the February morning she stood in the yard and told a stubborn, grieving, deeply frightened man that she was not going anywhere, and watched him begin, slowly and thoroughly and irreversibly, to understand that the family and the land were already the same thing. The land did not leave the family. The family grew to match the land. And spring, as it always does, came anyway.